Germany was obviously a huge reason why World War I eventually sparked. Their rise made other European powers scared. But there are other long-term causes which led up to World War I. Next, we're going to be talking about the role of imperialism. First of all, you have to know what imperialism is. It's the idea of taking over, either directly or indirectly, another nation and exerting your control over them. There are different reasons why countries would want to do this. In the time before World War I, the main motives for imperialism were obviously economic, where countries could obtain cheap raw materials, new markets, and low-cost labor by looking in remote places around the world. But also in the late 1800s and early 1900s, another key reason for imperialism was the idea of social Darwinism, which came about with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Social Darwinism is an adaptation of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in the natural world, and it is applied to social rules and operations in the idea that the spread of Western civilization was God's work, and therefore it justified taking over other peoples who had different religions and different ways of life. So these were the main motives for imperialism, but you could also throw into there nationalistic competition, which was heightened by the rise of Germany. With Germany specifically, it had a desire to make its influence felt outside of Europe. They needed to gain an overseas empire in order to be considered on par with the other European powers, such as Great Britain. The main locations that imperialism took place were in Africa and the Far East. These areas of the world contained many nations and groups of people that were prime targets for imperialism by the European powers because of their vulnerability and their lack of industrialization, what we would consider today third world countries. Different groups of people and individuals in the European countries and the United States encouraged this process of imperialism. Some of the most influential people for imperialism would be bankers and investors, because obviously they saw a way of gaining an economic profit if the country took over others around the world. They could then spread their businesses and banking operations to those locations and gain huge profits in the outcome. The different reaction of individual nations to imperialism was diverse. Different local interests in the nations that were being taken over by the process of imperialism actually encouraged this expansion by European governments so that their interests could be defended. There are some examples of this. There were some bondholders in Egypt that pressed the British government to actually occupy Egypt in 1882. Additionally, a man by the name of Karl Peters, a German explorer, called on Bismarck to help him consolidate the gains of his German East Africa Company. Furthermore, there were owners of gold mines and diamond mines in South Africa that pressed the British government to defend their interests. Many of these local interests saw the European powers as a way of gaining more profits for themselves. On the other hand, as the European powers involved themselves in imperializing these nations, they got dragged into national interests that had to be defended, and these localities also depended on the European powers to defend local nationalist movements. So the process of imperialism could become very complex. The way that European powers imperialized to gain territory was by a two-step process. Number one, they would attack small, weak powers and pre-industrialized peoples. And number two, they would ensure that these conflicts remained localized. Wherever any discord over territory arose, European powers would often cooperate in different types of diplomatic agreements to make sure that these crises did not escalate. An example would be the partition of West Africa that was decided peacefully by a number of European powers at the West Africa Conference in Berlin in 1884 through 1885. Also, Britain and Germany settled their problems in East Africa by peaceful negotiation. In the European countries' scramble for trading rights in China, which the United States was also a part of, this was also resolved by diplomatic agreement. On the other hand, sometimes imperial problems would just intensify the rivalry between many European powers. There were differences between Britain and France over North Africa that almost ended in a war in 1898. Additionally, British and Russian relations also often reached points of war over issues of mutual interest in different areas like Persia, Afghanistan, and China. So what were the biggest effects of imperialism? Well, all it did basically was intensify the rivalry that had already begun in Europe. This idea of imperialism made people in the European countries feel like their nation was the most powerful and the most important, and therefore they became extremely patriotic in a process called jingoism. They glorified their armed forces, especially in countries like Germany, which sought to expand its military rapidly. Britain, on the other hand, wanted to expand their navy at an alarming rate. These European powers obviously denied national self-determination to these peoples. They produced a lot of antagonism. It was basically a survival of the fittest mentality in which the strongest European powers and the United States would be the ones that had the most territory around the world. So obviously this had a negative effect on the idea of cooperation between the European countries and only served to promote an idea of it's my interest or yours, which therefore would obviously lead to a war.